So, having heard two techie views, one from the outside and one from the inside, I would like now to switch to a more, say, legal view. So, having not so much a technology in view, but the consequences and risks from a monetary and regulatory side. Please welcome Dr. Scott David. Hello, Scott.
Good, thank you.
Great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So you're a fellow analyst of KuppingerCole,
Yes,
right?
indeed.
But you're also, I hope I stated that correctly, the Director of Policy at the Center of Information Assurance and Cybersecurity at the University of Washington.
Yes, indeed.
What do you do there?
So we have a program at the University of Washington which has an open style of research for national security and other security issues. So for instance, one of our past graduates went on to be the head of China CERT, even though he was educated in this program in the United States. So the idea without security clearance is to create a neutral space where representatives from different companies, different countries can come in and talk about common security issues.
Interesting, interesting. So is that Chatham House rules style or?
Varies, depending on the program. We have a number of different programs, and the educational programs, other programs that we have publication programs, different kind of conference programs, things like that. But the idea is to really find out where there are common issues that we can create some infrastructure, some security infrastructure that's shared across different paradigms instead of focusing on the conflict all the time.
Okay. Oh, interesting. So, how do you see this firewall turn-down approach? I mean, breaking down the perimeter from an attorney's view.
Yeah, well, it's actually a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about. One of the things that I'm going to mention in the slides is that the secrecy has died, but privacy and security don't have to die with it. And so if you keep an old strategy, it's like a program running in an inappropriate circumstance. So we're relying upon old views, as Robbie and other folks have said, but they're not fit for purpose in the new condition that we're facing.
Okay. Very interesting to hear about that.
You.
Thank you very much about your talk. I think
Excellent.
the clicker up.
Oh, clicker over there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's a 2-button binary clicker. That's very nice. So I want to talk, as I mentioned before, about mapping, mitigating, and mining risk really in a new set of dimensions. And the idea that I want to talk about, it's 3 parts really, and they're kind of blended in the beginning. There's a risk mapping idea, and that's really just understanding what we're talking about. The fundamental answer to the question, the spoiler alert, is that risk is a shadow of organizational value. Anytime you have value, you have risk. I know that sounds like a lawyer's view, and indeed it is. But the risk, if you don't care about the value of something, you don't have risk. Risk mitigation, one of the things I want to talk about is how do we govern, and Robbie was alluding to that before, how do you govern in a situation where you have a permeable membrane at the end of any organization? And what I want to talk about is outsourcing, something very familiar as a model for moving from outsourcing really is a notion of a provisional type of governance, which we'll talk about, and moving to a notion which is more positive interaction, which is intergovernance, the idea of governing the gaps. And then thirdly, I want to talk about, I think it's 8 or 9 different trends that are coming up that are affecting everyone. As I was mentioning just a moment ago, there are some things that affect all of our organizations, all countries, all companies. They're intrinsic in the structures that we've been adopting, and if we don't deal with them directly, then we'll be not being effective. So the first notion is the idea of mapping the edge of organizations. The key issue, and I'm not going to read the slides, so I'll leave that to you. Mostly they're not so much text, but the key issue is that boundary. There's many different kinds of boundaries. We're not talking about physical. We're not talking about managerial only. We're talking about a variety of different things. Any metric becomes a boundary. So start thinking about the concept of anytime you see a measurement, that's a purported boundary. There's something being measured, a performance being measured against that. So I want to go through a few slides on the outsourcing notion. So companies once did this, extending credit. This was then we moved on to credit cards, where it was the third-party network that was engaged. So think about that. Companies had a risk. They outsourced the risk to credit cards. Now there's other risks. Whenever you outsource, you don't get rid of risk. You just change your risk. But presumably, credit cards do it better than chasing after your people who owe you money. Companies once did this. This is payroll, and then this came along, standardized payroll networks. Companies, oops. There we go. Companies once did this, shipping. I think it's an interesting combination of foods they're selling there, but shipping. But then this came along, FedEx and UPS. Companies once did this, advertising. Then this came along, TV, and then the internet. Companies once did this, data processing internally. Well, then this came along, server farms. I think that a lot of it was extra capacity that corporations had that they wanted to reuse, but in any event. So the data handling function got outsourced. Well, companies once did this, identity. Then this came along, the internet. And so that, intrinsically, when we started adopting internet technologies inside companies, you opened up your enterprise whether you liked it or not. We didn't really understand that at the time. It was just convenient. So it was an organization, in a sense, a big organism, but it doesn't have an identity layer. So the question is now we need to solve for X. What's the risk associated with that adoption? It's almost like we did the adoption, but now we're trying to figure out what we've done to ourselves. So these, again, I'm not going to read the slides, but we need to solve that risk issue. So anytime we have a system, and institutions are systems, they're knowledge management systems in a sense. Obviously, some institutions have a governmental purpose, some have a commercial purpose, or a variety of other purposes. But at the edge, there's always monsters at the edge. There be monsters. I read a book, incidentally, that's indicated that the monsters were first created by early map makers for a competitive advantage. What they were trying to do is suggest that the other people's maps were inadequate and that the unknowns actually were a problem. So it was a competitive issue among map makers, apparently, with the monsters. So again, going back to those edge risks, so think about your organization. Think about this firewall as a notion as if there was actually a wall there. We use that idea conveying that there is a wall, and how high is the wall, how thick is the wall? Well, it's all just conceptual. What do those edges look like? One of the big messages I have here is that the conference sessions that we're going to engage in are part of this process. We're actually doing provisional governance right here, and we'll get back to that in a minute. So one of the things about the edge forces innovation. There's a movement, a French literary movement called the Aleppo movement. My pronunciation may be wrong, but the authors in the movement actually cause themselves arbitrary constraint to induce creativity. So for instance, one of them wrote a novel without using the letter E, or one of the people in the movement died and they wrote a eulogy just using the letters of his name. So they were using constraint to evoke creativity. When we have constraint, regulatory constraints, the laws of physics, it depends on what your organization does, those constraints can be seen as opportunities for growing and understanding that constraint and then embracing that in a sense. There's a book that was written recently called Governing Failure, and it was about the financial work in the development area, in developing countries, written by a woman, Jennifer Best. And she came up with the concept of provisional governance. And what she said is, what happens with organizations at the edges, and again, using the development context, these four things happen quite often. You have emphasis on standards, you have harm and risk management emphasis, performance measurement, and clarifying interests, and she meant there is property interests in that context. But if you look at these are kind of what we're talking about here. So we have a sense that actually we're engaged in provisional governance, and what I'm in fact inviting is the idea that provisional governance isn't something that's going to happen in the future. This is a delegation now assembled to do provisional governance, and we'll talk about the specifics in a minute. But think about those things. When you see standards, the risk management idea, performance measurement, and clarifying interest questions during the conference, you're seeing provisional governance, and each one of those is an opportunity for your own organization to grow. So one of the things I'm going to talk about here is the idea that provisional governance is really where institutions are born. It's process innovation in a sense, because it's forced sometimes, because again, that idea of the constraint. But one of the things that has been investigated by a gentleman named Porter and Ronit, they looked at, I think it was a couple of hundred different organizations, primarily European, if I recall correctly. I think they were from the Netherlands. I may be wrong on that. But they looked and they said, well, what's common across all rulemaking organizations, whether it's legislative, self-regulatory, et cetera? What was common were these 5 steps: agenda setting, problem identification, decision being made on those problems, implementation, and then review. It's a feedback loop. So if you think about it at the edge of your organization, you're encountering things that are unfamiliar. If you engage in these problems, you say, well, I have an agenda, we just had a problem. What's the problem? Let's talk about it, let's make a decision about it, let's implement and review. And in a sense, you're mining that edge, constantly probing that edge. That is characteristic both of internal processes and on the edge processes. And what I'm asserting is that because it's characteristic of rulemaking in institutions, and all institutions are rulemakers in some sense, whether it's internal rules, outside rules, because it's characteristic of both the internal and external rulemaking, that allows us to start to take that externality and bring it into the organization. And I think that goes to Ravi's point earlier about one of the issues of how do we engage this? What does this look like? And really, it's an ability to be innovative about your processes, not just your products. So one of the things that's the points I was just making, it's that cultivating that intergovernance. In a sense, if you have an organization, you're encountering challenges at the edge, you're going to say, I have a failure there at the edge, and it's provisional governance from the perspective of inside the organization, because you're saying, I like to do X, now I have to do X plus 1, that's provisional. We really want to return to X when we can. But what I'm asserting is, when you have the collective of organizations all engaging in that activity, finding externalities that they're not used to, everyone has the same problem at the same time. And that's a wonderful, as a transactional lawyer for 30 years, when you see people in the room and they think they're conflicting, but they actually are experiencing the same problem, you know you're going to get to a good solution. So let's talk about how that intergovernance might start. Each one of your organizations has a provisional governance setting right now. You have failures at the edge somewhere, minor, hopefully minor, but if they're minor or major, how do we convert that notion of, oh, this is a problem, into it being an opportunity? So here's the internet. This is a couple of years old, so there's even more spaghetti in the bowl now. And you're here. There we are, right there. So how do we start to unpack that? How do we start to make that have some sense? Well, these are some pictures. I didn't take them, but they're from New York, where I'm from originally. Now I'm in Seattle, in Washington. But these are pictures of districts in New York. So one of the things that can be an opportunity for starting to crystallize some of the communities is to start to look for communities of interest. So for instance, on the pictures here, you have the plant. In New York, there's a plant district. There's a fashion district, and people know about that. There's a financial district and a lighting district. The people have gotten together because there's an affinity, a community of interest in the economic. Their supply chains are similar, their financing structures, their customer relationships, so they tend to aggregate. Another reason people aggregate is cultural. There are language issues, so we have Greek, Russian, Italian, and Chinese neighborhoods in New York. So those are natural things that drew people together. Within the complexity of New York City, people find each other and they find communities. What I'm suggesting is that when people have common challenges, like we're going to talk about in the conference here, that those are also communities of interest, right? They're not yet as familiar to us as some of these, but they will become familiar. And I think Martin was alluding to that before, that it takes less time now to explain what he does sometimes. So here we are. Here's the world, and we have networks. And so how might we get started? Well, this is a list. If you want to find communities of interest and community of interest governance, look at the green is what we call the type of entity. It's a group of entities, and the blue is their output. So you can find those artifacts. So you look at markets, for instance. Well, they come up with trading metrics. So you'll have, if you're on the orange juice exchange, it'll be a different set of trading metrics than you find in a stock exchange, for instance. And then you have standard-setting organizations and a variety of these things. So some of these are governance and recognizable. Some of them are intergovernance type of settings where people come together and have an output to normalize their externality. And I think one way to say it is that primarily security is moving to a situation of excluding the externality to rendering the externality innocuous. And if a number of people simultaneously render their externalities so that they're not threatening, that's a sustainable type of security. So one of the problems you have is that every company or every country, everyone's doing it, is trying to promote their own agenda. And so what do we do? What does it look like when you have organizational edges coming together? Again, what do those frizzle of those opportunity spaces look like? Well, this is a diagram that I actually used in some work we're doing with the United Nations right now. What those are phase space diagrams. It's the idea that when you make a decision, if I leave this room and I turn left, I might find a euro on the ground, and if I turn right, I might get hit by a car. So the idea is, as phase space opens up, you change your future, and these are just phase space diagrams of organizations A, B, C, and D. And the fundamental idea with the UN is, I said, that when you have that intermediary norm or set of ethics or a concept, then it can make A, B, C, and D more neutralized. You identify the commonalities, as I was alluding to before, among the organizations, and that can change the idea, change the conceptualization of the risk. So now I want to talk more specifically about these 8 things, and each one of the next slides will be one of these 8. These are the fundamental challenges that are facing every one of your organizations and every organization and every national organization, as we alluded to before. And I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of these and what risks they provide and what opportunities they provide as well. This is one of the most important. So this is a diagram. You may have heard the name Paul Baran, B-A-R-A-N. In 1966, he wrote a paper for the RAND Corporation, and you can see on the left, Air Force project. This was a defensive system, a military defensive system. The internet was originally developed. So the idea here, imagine that we're all the dots. Everyone in this room is the dots. And let's say we're all employees at the same company. And let's say we're talking about issue X, and we're all sitting at our desks and on the common corporate server. The diagram that's a centralized diagram, the left-hand diagram there, shows if the CEO or an administrator wants to go in and see what the conversation is, they have a central point they can do it. It's a centralized information flow. The challenge is if the CEO gets hit by a truck or the system goes down, that's the problem with centralized flow. So imagine that us, the same people, talking about the same issue, sitting at the same desks, being employees of the same company. Now let's say we all go on Twitter or Facebook. What happened is it became decentralized. That's the right, or distributed, excuse me. That's the right-hand diagram. Exactly the same people dealing with the same issue. Now can the CEO find it? The CEO just got rendered blind immediately, just like that, by the adoption of that distributed network. That was the intention in the context of attack. The challenge is when you resist attack, you also resist control. And so that's that blindness, what you're having now with the countries and companies, all hierarchical organizations utilize centralized information flows. That's what the hierarchies need. They've all been rendered blind. And what's happening now is to a greater or lesser extent. And what's happening now is they're still running the same program. And the problem is they don't know what the externality looks like. Does it say 2? Perfect. So the challenge we're all experiencing is that blindness challenge. The next one is the fact that the systems are socio-technical. So you see here a driver. The car can't take care of what the driver's doing. There's people and equipment working together and creating risk. You can't deal with socio-technical systems with just technical solutions. If you want to render the technology and the people reliable, you need standards for both. Technology is rendered reliable by conformity to specifications. People are rendered reliable by conformity to laws and policies, and so that you need both. Complexity growth. We look at complexity as a problem, but complexity is also an opportunity. Think about FEMA in Katrina when it hit in the United States, a big hurricane. That was a first-order risk because it was a hurricane, but there was a second-order problem of the lack of governance and ability of FEMA to react to it. So all of us have the opportunity. We can't prevent hurricanes. We can't prevent attacks necessarily, but you can prevent reacting poorly to the attacks, and so that's another opportunity. Scale consequences, this is the Power of 10. I don't know if people have seen that movie or book. It's the idea that at different scales you have different systems that are in operation, and understanding those scaling differences is very important because you can't apply the same strategy at every scale. And when you outsource, you have different scale. You have something inside the company, and then you have something shared among many companies. New metrics fire hose. This is the idea that with big data and other data systems, we have now more data and we see a lot of correlations, but we don't understand causation. So the question here is, was sunburn more risky before we knew how it happened, right? So the answer is no, but sort of yes, because we didn't know it was risky, so we didn't perceive a risk. So now when you go to the beach and you see SPF 50 or SPF 2, you can tell what kind of risk-taking person you're dealing with. But the metrics almost invite a perception of risk. Data is a dual-use technology. So this is the idea nitrogen fertilizer was used in growing apples and also used in the attack in Oklahoma City. Is nitrogen. Do we stop selling nitrogen fertilizer? No. So we don't make hammers soft so they can't be used to hit people on the head. We make hammers hard and say don't hit people on the head with hammers, right? You don't make cars go slow so they can't be used in bank robberies. You make them go fast and say don't rob banks. So with data, it's the same thing. It can be used for bad or good. It should say can do harm or good. But that's the notion, is we need to approach the problem correctly, which is the use of data in this context. And then this is an aside I won't go into, but it's a theoretical issue. I'll let you folks take a look at the slides later at your leisure. But data and information are different when you, the idea is data plus meaning equals information. And that's why Facebook can reuse the same data and create new and new value, because they keep putting it in an extra context for advertising. That's critical because it gives you more dimensionality, more freedom of movement in designing your system. Here's one that I hope seems provocative, but ultimately won't be. Secrecy is dead, but privacy and security don't have to die with it, and that's a choice we make. Lastly, this is people as data producers. Right now, if I buy a book on Amazon, the book goes this way to me, the data goes that way. In what way am I a consumer of data? I haven't consumed the data, I've produced the data. The reason these pictures are here is the Grange idea is people as producers, the Grange organized farmers so they could be producers with organization that could have some market efficacy. But the problem on the right side is that you also, when you become part of a system, you feel like a little bit entangled on that, so that can be a challenge as well. And again, I'll let you glance at these, but the most important point is the last one, buckle your seatbelts, because it's going to be a wild ride.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Woo! That was a ride.
Yeah, that's 43 slides. I think.
Yeah, I mean, nevertheless, it's very interesting, and I think one big takeaway is that we need, if we use technology, then we need governance on how to use it and how it's going to be also managed in an organization with people. And that the IT/OT trend is going to demand for new governance processes.
Yes,
whether they are provisional, as you mentioned it, or other ones, this is still going to be seen, I think. And who's going to win the race, we don't know yet. But definitely it's something new around the corner.
Yeah, well, you know, and we have the same interoperability. I mean, you learned English, I don't know German. It's an interoperable technology that we use, and so thank you, because we wouldn't be able to have the interoperation of this presentation without that. So that management is something that comes naturally when we understand risk and we understand leverage, and the idea of these interoperable policies and adoptions is going to be a critical part of that, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
If you want to see more about this, there's going to be sessions tomorrow and on Thursday, I think, where you're going to get a little bit more detail on digital risk. Thank you very much.